Back, you're watching African Perspective, and we're looking at the role of the youth in government, in elections. And on our social media, we've run a poll asking you to vote, asking you, are young people taking an active role in politics of their countries? Let's take a look at how you voted. 43% of you voted yes, while 57% voted no. And some of your views, I've got Akim Amans, who writes on Twitter that no, we have better stuff to worry about, like securing a job that the current government is making difficult for us to obtain. Oliver Muhiriro says, many young people have been so disenfranchised with politics since not proving to solve their contemporary issues, example, youth unemployment and affordable quality tertiary education. And finally, NYC Devon, Denise, I think it's scary to get ourselves involved in these revolutionary parties and go against them. We all know the consequences. So these are your sentiments. So why should young people in South Africa take any particular interest in voting in the May 8, 2019 poll? Some say young people's cynicism, if not realism, about the shortcomings of failures of politics and the political system stand between them and registering to vote in large numbers and eventually casting a vote. We're in the studio now with political analyst Khaya Sithole and Mabine Seale of the official opposition Democratic Alliance in South Africa. Thank you to you both for joining us. I suppose let me just start with Mr. Seale. Seeing that that you are a young person who is in a political party, the official opposition, do you think young people are disaffected by politics in general or formal politics?
I think to an extent, yes. But I mean, when you look at party political rallies, when you look at social unrest, in the main, they're led by young people. And I think this speaks to politics in a sense, failing young people. But also, I think as a Democratic Alliance, we have a proud history of pushing young people into leadership positions and ensuring that their voices are heard, and that when their voices are not only heard, that the decisions that they make, the decisions are upheld. When we look at Parliament, yes, more young people could be represented there. But we're pushing young people to ensure that their voices are heard there, because you cannot talk about the future if you're not talking with and for young people.
And I suppose that's the point, Mr. Stoller. You can't talk about a future if you aren't talking with young people. So political parties will say, yes, we are talking to them. We've created many platforms to talk to them. But are they actively involved in policy design? Because ultimately, that's what young people want in order to have their grievances or problems addressed.
I think the big issue is that young people will say that the political parties talk about them, not necessarily with them. And in the South African context, I think our fundamental weakness is that when you talk about the idea of policy formulation, for instance, it is still a rather opaque and a very, very difficult thing for young people to sort of engage with. And of course, the way that policy formulation ought to work is that it ought to be as open-ended as to enable any young person to say, I understand what it is that is going on. But unfortunately, what we've seen here is that because the way the policies gets formulated is that it really just appeals to people who either have a very, very good academic understanding of what the issues are or have a vested interest in that particular topic. So it's not a universal process where suddenly you can say that, for example, this week the tourism amendment bill is up for discussion and young people have an understanding what it's all about, what the point of a bill is and how it becomes an act. So I think that we're still missing that element of really just the political education of the young people for them to sort of understand how the political process works. And of course, for us to then come back to them every 5 years for general elections and every 5 years for local elections and say, hey, come and endorse this particular process that they themselves don't feel to be continuously and integrally part of, it's very difficult to convince them to then say, this is a system that ought to work. So I do think that we still have a very, very big lesson to learn as a country as to how to continuously engage young people in the political process so that by the time we get to a general election, they see this as a natural transition of endorsing or rejecting the ideas that they've been hearing on a continuous basis. To then try to bombard them with these new ideas, these manifestos and these ideas and these issues just ahead of a general election is a bit problematic.
Let's talk about new ideas, Mr. Siabe. If we're talking about the normal and orthodox, which is turning young people away from participating. We've seen the advent of new politics through the hashtag Fees Must Fall movement, how young people have immersed themselves and changed the agenda. We saw that with the Arab Spring a long time ago in the Middle East and many other countries. What are the new platforms that young people are creating, and how much more effective are they in communicating with other young people?
And absolutely, I think it's very important that young people feel that they're part of the political system. And as you've mentioned, the Arab Spring, Fees Must Fall, and so on. They follow a long history of young people challenging the status quo. And if young people aren't heard, they're going to get frustrated. The majority of young people are unemployed. Therefore, we've got to create platforms that reach young people. We've got to engage with young people on social media. We've got to create platforms. I mean, my party has what they call a Dear Young Leaders program, where it mentors young people so that once they go through that program of mentorship, they're able to fully participate through the complex systems of policy making, so they feel that they're part of it. They don't feel ambushed when they get to Parliament, and they feel confident in themselves to be able to speak for young people and ensure that their position is adopted and they're able to successfully lobby that position.
Mr. Sithole, if you look at the number of young people who are undecided about whom to vote for, it's quite high. And research is saying that young people are more involved when it's issue-based driven. So, and I'm going to look at South Africa within the global community and obviously within the region. Take a matter like Sudan, the developments there. Hassan Omar al-Bashir has been criticized for continuing to be recognized as a leader of state by the African Union. He's now being deposed by a civilian movement. Is there an opportunity now for a regional player like the African Union to redress that kind of situation, either pushing for him to go to the ICC or ensuring that civilian rule is installed and peacefully in the Sudan?
It's a very difficult one, especially when you speak about the ICC, because I think legitimately a lot of people in the African continent feel that the ICC itself has become a very tainted institution simply because of the bias that it tends to have not to pursue what you might call as similar infractions committed by Western leaders. So I do think that the ICC has got particular issues that it needs to resolve. But of course, when you talk about the Sudan in particular, we've seen even over this past week, which was when we see this coup or this deposition of this particular leader, it really has been led by the grassroots. And I think what you're seeing here is that there is this common thread that, occasionally people think that the political process is far too rigid, so they find a way to bypass it. And we've seen, whether you're talking about Paris in 1968, you're talking about Soweto in 1976, you're talking about Tiananmen Square in 1989, these have all been popular uprisings where people have said, look, we understand what the political system has given us, we do not like it. We have then decided that we need to get together, either as young people or society at large, and then protest against the system. And of course, you get mixed reactions. Perhaps Paris 1968 and so to 1976 got very good outcomes. Tiananmen Square didn't get such good outcomes. Then you saw the Arab Spring around 2010 and 2011, where perhaps the outcomes were a bit different. So I do think that, particularly if you're looking at these systems as a young person, it's very difficult for you to understand why an organization like the African Union would not itself then say, look, if the people on the ground in Sudan have said that this is no longer the system that we want to be governing us, we want things to be done differently, why that system fails to engage them and says, okay, fine, we hear your voices. The systems like the African Union tend to defend the status quo, tend to defend the rigid politics and say, no, this is the way to do things, this is the way you must manage these transitions. And of course, for young people who can then see, particularly in the age of social media and the fluidity of information, where they can see that in other countries or in other jurisdictions, things have been made to happen by young people or even just society at large, taking to the streets and saying we're no longer satisfied with this. It then says to them, why is our system failing to react to this? And I think when we talk about Fees Must Fall that I participated in particular in 2015, it really ushered in a new era where young people in particular felt that if the system is as rigid as it is, there are ways to bypass it and get the particular outcomes.
But how long does it remain, Mr. Siabe? And I'm asking this thinking about, we mentioned the Arab Spring earlier on. I remember the 2012 elections. I was there, I was observing it. There were little, if no, youth representativity in terms of on the ballot poll. So that said, that while gains were made, 5 steps back were taken. So that means those rigid systems remain. How do young people ensure that they change the game on the system? Because you're talking about institutions that comes with rules. So if you talk about non-formal politics, that means you need a change of behavior.
Absolutely. I think as young people, we shouldn't tire of fighting against the status quo. As long as once we tire, that's when the system wins and the older generation wins. And like you've correctly stated, the older generation like to take time to do things, whereas change needs to be instituted now. That's why our youth leader, Luolo Mpiti, at the age of 27, is running a program called Sidigi on the ground, where he's engaging with young people, finding out what is it that they're tired about, what is the kind of change.
What do they say in South Africa going into the elections? But why are they angry?
Young people are tired of being unemployed. I mean, young people, by and large, when you have service delivery protests, it's young people at the forefront of that. When political parties have rallies during the day, it's young people who are there because they simply aren't in employment. And not only are young people unemployed, they're also unemployable. Government likes to talk about the fourth industrial revolution, but we don't even have the basic platforms to ensure that we're able to keep up with the rest of the world. And Africa, I mean, between now and 2050 is almost going to double its youth population. But the systems and the policies are not keeping up with that. That's why young people need to be in parliament so they can agitate for that change. Young people need to be in parliament so that people can see the face of young people and hear the voices of young people.
So one of the tweets, Mr. Sithole, is saying that young people are disenfranchised, and obviously access to money, access to power and influence is one of the bigger ways that they can change the game on behalf of other young people. And I'm thinking now, if we just go across to our northern neighbors, Zimbabwe, they fought for change, young people would say, for a long time, and then there was a change. They now have a young opposition leader who is in place, but some would argue the game is still the same. So not much has changed even for young people in being empowered, whether it's via employment or opportunities, representativity. So is it maybe that independent candidates could be the answer to this? We've seen a court challenge here in South Africa calling for that.
Yeah, I mean, when you really look at it, particularly in a situation like Zimbabwe, of course, there was this groundswell movement to say that we need to have a regime change. But of course, it was still championed by primarily the older people. And they even ended up with a president who just seems to be even older than the previous ones, although he isn't factually. I do think that a lot of young people would have said that, look, we thought that this was ushering in a new era, and yet we still end up with a 77-year-old leading the country. So of course it then amplifies the frustrations. But I do suspect that the reality is that particularly in Africa, where you're talking about countries that have recovered from colonialism, you still have this idea that a lot of people feel that the people that are entitled to political power and political leadership are the people that deliver that form of liberation, whether you're talking about Zimbabwe, South Africa. And of course we then defer to assuming that they have the best institutional memory and the best institutional know-how how to run political systems. But of course the political systems that they run themselves are then operating in an ecosystem where the world is evolving. And of course, as the world evolves, it means that younger people are much more in tune with what the issues of the day are. And I do think that it still is taking us back as Africans when we have this idea that old people are the ones that are in power, when the type of issues that really ought to be championed are issues that are very specific to young people. And it's not saying that we shouldn't have old people, but there should be a blend, there should be an embrace of the young people within the political system to say that we'd like to hear ideas because you're the future leaders.
Talk about that blend just very quickly, Mr. Siabe. If we're talking then about also allegiance, whether it's political or not, stability is required. And I'm asking, as a party, looking at the region, if we look at the Middle East, there's obviously concern there in terms of security. Who would you say ideologically your party identifies with and you would like to work closer with?
Well, I mean, we have an established platform called the African Liberal Network, where we speak with social democratic and liberal parties on the continent in the main who are in opposition, and equally on the Southern African community. The DA leader leads a South African Partnership for Democratic Change, where he interacts with opposition leaders who are in the main young. So I think there needs to be an allegiance, not along political party lines, but allegiance among young people who want that kind of change to happen now, and work with the systems that exist, but also at the same time work within that system and try change that system.
And Mr. Sithole, just finally, do you think when we're talking about ideologically, there's still a view that there's a Northern Hemisphere bias, and also because of political and economic muscle? Is part of the problem the fact that unless they endorse someone, if you look at what's happening in Venezuela, then the kind of young people who progress become problematic to them as well?
Yeah, I mean, there is that issue of then saying, when you do want to open up the space to younger people, do you then want to sort of then guide or restrict them into what it is that they can sort of engage in? And as you spoke earlier on, a lot of people then fear that the stability of the country is under threat when you bring in young people who probably don't have the institutional memory of running these very bureaucratic institutions. So there's always the tension that you need to try and resolve them. And I suspect for me, the balance is what you need to say that, well, if you're going to sort of transition young people into specific parts of governance, how do you then guide them properly so that they emerge as the leaders who understand what the system is about, not just simply throw them under the bus? And I think that that's what we're still struggling with.
Thank you to you both. Interesting discussion, which we could have spoken a little longer. That there is Mabine from the Opposition Democratic Alliance here in South Africa, and political analyst Khaya Sithole. That's all we have time for on tonight's episode on African Perspective. Next week, we continue the conversation with a young man who started a political organization. The Globe is up next.